Live. Sorry, we were running a bit late for anybody who's just now tuning in. This is me, of course, Dave Feldman. I'm being joined by my good friend and collaborator, Nick Norwitz. How you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So I have the crew that's in house today, and so we're actually doing some filming with the documentary. Thought I'd open up the floor to some Q&A, but before we do, let's go ahead and. You said that there's a new CAC paper that came out.
Oh yeah, I'm only while we were killing time getting the video set up. I was just Matt Budoff actually tweeted it. It just came out, I think today, looking at all-cause mortality and CAC. Kind of beating a dead horse here, but it was that higher CACs above 100 were associated with increased risk of all-cause death and adverse cardiovascular outcomes above standard risk factors, read ApoB, LDL. So, yeah, wouldn't surprise you or me, but I like seeing all the functional studies.
Yeah, CAC, I mean, I don't know. It's fascinating to me and somewhat concerning at the same time that we've had so much great data with CAC all the way up to now. And we had great data 30 years ago. So it does concern me sometimes that this field doesn't always advance quite as fast as we'd like them to. And CAC, unfortunately, is an example. But I don't know. I think social media is going to help maybe accelerate that a bit more. Hopefully, in our case, if we've got some novel data ourselves to share here soon.
Yeah, I'm sure we will.
So we do have people watching. So it's interesting. I'm having a little trouble finding where the group chat is, which you normally do. Normally open your chat channel. Changed around.
I can see the sidebar. Can you see the sidebar with some questions? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. Yes. If anybody has any questions, feel free to post them here in the chat. We can actually see them coming in from both from YouTube and also from the Lean Mass Hyperresponder and Cholesterol Code Facebook groups, which is great. And it looks as if we already have one coming in from Wicked Low Carb. Hi, David Nick. Would you please explain how ketones fit into the lipid energy model? I can't seem to get the connection. Thanks. So ketones, of course, usually when you're hearing the term keto diet, that's what we're referring to, keto being short for keto. And the process of ketogenesis is the breakdown of fatty acids into ketone bodies. Of special interest is where that happens in the liver with hepatocytes. Hepatocytes can convert fatty acid over to a ketone body. Now, without getting too much into that, I will say I'm especially interested in how that plays into the lipid energy model because there's not the only possible fate of a fatty acid inside of the liver. Another direction it can go is to be reattached together with other fatty acids into the stored form of fat known as a triglyceride and then loaded onto a lipoprotein and then shipped back out of the liver. And we think that that has an important connection to why there may be higher LDL cholesterol for many people on a low-carb diet. Did you want to add to that, Nick?
No, I guess I'd say just to simplify it, ketone bodies are kind of like a litmus test for the metabolic state that is conducive to the lipid energy model and the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. It's not that they are causing it per se. It's that the conditions you need to get the LMHR phenotype would also produce this other product. So litmus test of sorts.
We have another one. What's up with the CAC exercise and statin paradox, where they seem to increase calcification but is protective? You want to take that one?
I mean, simply put, I think, calcified plaques are the stable plaques. Most plaques that cause Levine sign, you clutch your heart, you fall over, you die, are plaques that develop kind of a thin capsule, then rupture, and then you get thrombosis and an immediate clotting, get a heart attack and die. So calcification isn't per se bad. It's a response, but I think that hopefully answers your question. That said, it doesn't mean the calcification is good either. A CAC score that's positive over time does have negative health consequences or is associated with, as evidenced by the data. So there are a lot of things in medicine actually where sometimes a medication will cause an adverse change in a marker or an apparent adverse change in a marker, and it appears paradoxical. But if you understand the physiology, that's not necessarily the case. ACE inhibitors, which are antihypertensive drug, can have negative effects on kidney function labs. SGLT2s can increase LDL cholesterol levels, et cetera, et cetera. And you can always post hoc rationalize, but all of these things are only markers. So we have to take it in the context of the physiology.
Yeah, it's an area that I'm especially interested in, calcification in particular, because there are a lot of folks who certainly believe that some amount of calcification is likely a good thing, and that it's a stabilization and a consolidation. This is a lot of what's put forward in the case of, for example, where some cholesterol-lowering medications can result in an increase in calcification. And to the extent to where I think soft plaque are ultimately resulting in a higher calcification to where they're getting converted to calcified plaque, I suspect that that's probably the case, but we need a lot more research on that. And fortunately, there's a lot more that's coming. TJ Riley says, "Hi, Dave. I have extremely high LDL and high ApoB. Should I be concerned given the high ApoB 57-year-old male eating carnivore for a year?" So I'm going to give it the same general and somewhat unsatisfying answer that I give all the time, which is, we just don't know until we've managed to get a lot more data. And that's really what the lean mass hyperresponder study is there for right now. Nick Norwitz and a number of other high-level luminaries have actually penned a great editorial that I recommend everybody read that emphasizes that there should be some caution, and that we do need this exact research I'm describing. We need more of it to come into play. Can you make comments on the Lp(a) levels in the lean mass hyperresponder cohort? This is by an unknown Facebook user. Yeah, I can say that we are measuring it in the existing study, in the LMHR study. Currently, we have a lot of anecdotal data, and the anecdotal data seems to have a high variety. There are some folks that have low levels. I myself have immeasurably low levels, like it doesn't even fill up. And my colleague Siobhan Huggins, she has high levels. Nick, you might have something to add to this one.
I have high levels as well. I mean, there is an aspect of it that is just genetically determined. Like, I think people have a certain floor. My dad has a lot of Kringle repeats. That's the genetics of it. As do I. So my levels have always been high. And if you actually look at like baseline mixed diet versus current diet, my LDL levels went up like 5.5-fold to peak. My Lp(a) levels really didn't change, but they were always high. So whereas I had low LDL on a mixed diet, my Lp(a) was high. I went keto, my LDL went through the roof. Lp(a) really didn't change much. So
And
that's in anything. Take it for what you will.
Given research from, or for that matter, a lot of more high frequency data that's been collected from my colleague Siobhan, she's shown that Lp(a) levels do tend to follow the patterns of ApoB and many other of these lipid markers, but also because it's an acute phase reactant, she's shown when she's been sick that they also tend to get influenced by other inflammatory markers such as C-reactive protein. So I think it's interesting, and I'm interested to see how much that gets further elucidated by the data we'll have from the lean mass hyperresponder study. This is from GetFit. Hello from California. Thank you for your efforts and your research. Question: any info on HDL being too high? I had HDL 111, triglycerides of 62, LDL of 183, total cholesterol of 303. The standard caveat, by the way, even though you may have some of your individual data in here, both Nick and I will be answering in broad strokes, and of course, nothing we say should be taken as medical advice. However, that said, I will say anecdotally, we do tend to find that the higher levels LDL goes when typically matched with low triglycerides. Typically, HDL will correlate with those higher and higher levels in lean mass responders. For example, if somebody has, say, an LDL of 500 or 600 or 700, it's more likely that their HDL will be 90, 100, 120, etc. Again, can't say for sure if that's a good or a bad thing. That's part of why we're getting this research, and in particular, the LMHR study should be able to help with that, because I think we'll probably have a number of people who have high HDL in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if the person asking the question is aware of the epidemiology on the topic, but my understanding is it's probably where the question's coming from. You'll hear people talk about HDL being too high now because based on large scale studies, we see this U-shaped curve with outcomes and HDL, where it's like, oh yeah, if you have HDL above 80, it's actually associated with worse outcomes, the U shape. This is something we've addressed before. Actually, we had sections and papers on it that we had to cut for space. But I think the thing I want to emphasize, which Dave alluded to, is that the epidemiology on this topic does not translate per se into lean mass hyperresponders, because, you know, the epidemiological studies presumably have a high influence of genetics, whereas LMHR, it's a metabolic response. So if you have high HDL, lots of things can cause it. You can imagine like a defect in a receptor in the liver, kind of like putting a dam downstream where you get backup and you have dysfunctional HDL flux, which is different than an increase in HDL as part of a metabolic system, which we propose with the lipid energy model. So take on point for what I'm trying to say is I won't draw any conclusions in terms of whether or not a high HDL is a certain amount of good or a certain amount of bad based on the epidemiology when applied to lean mass hyperresponders. I think that's not a fair logical leap.
And I'll add one more thing, which is that there's also, sorry, I turn on notifications. I'll just add one more thing, and that there's also alcoholism is very relevant, because alcoholism can also further increase HDL, and it sort of depends on at what stage it's at. But it's one thing that we're always interested in when we're finding any research that shows that association of very high levels of HDL with poor.
Can I jump on? Jennifer Lucas has a question about microvascular diseases. So the question is, does keto impact cardiac microvascular disease like larger arteries? So I actually think this is the answer is yes. But I actually think in a positive way. I don't know if that was the implication. So microvascular disease, like arteriolosclerosis, the olo means the small vessels. So you got your big arteries and your medium and your small. The small ones, when you have defects there, it's called arteriolosclerosis. And there's different types. The more common type is called high-line, and that occurs because of either diabetes or hypertension. Those are the kind of two main drivers. You can think about it as kind of pushing proteins in, and you get this thickening of the small vessels. It can cause a lot of negative things. One thing that might jump to mind is like strokes, particularly in the deep brain. They're called lacunar strokes. But the emphasis here is that the thing that really drives it is the hypertension and the diabetes. Those are the kind of the two major risk factors. And so ketogenic diets tend to be very good at lowering blood pressure and lowering glucose. So I would think almost even more so than large vessel disease risk markers. For small vessel disease markers, things that would cause this, like lacunar strokes or associated pathologies, ketogenic diets probably would have a lot of potential for good, in my opinion. Anyway, thought that was a good question.
This one from Mikey Plus. Dave is my salt role model. Thinking about the way he salted his food made us use a lot more. It really made me feel better. Near zero carb. Yes. So my salt journey has been a long one. It took me a long time to realize it really was just as simple as salt. I kept ruling it out because I thought that I was already putting more than enough salt on my food. And so I kept thinking it couldn't be that. And so I kept playing with magnesium and potassium. I was pretty confident it was some electrolyte. And then late in 2018, I decided as an experiment for 2 weeks, I was just going to consume salt with abandon. I was going to have as much salt as I wanted on anything, but on top of that, I was going to have salt water, etc. And at the end of those 2 weeks, I felt really great. Now, to be fair, I was mindful of what is the common take that salt will increase blood pressure. And Steve Finney, I believe, has been quoted. Hopefully, I'm not misquoting him. I think he says around 5% of the population does have a salt sensitivity. And that salt sensitivity may mean that you could be at a higher risk of increasing your blood pressure for greater consumption of salt. So, as always, don't take this as medical advice. But that said, There have been a number of people, not a lot, it's a fraction, number of people who say they think they're like me and that they just need a whole lot more salt than they realized. And after just doing the same thing I did, having a lot more salt with abandon, they found that it was very helpful. The symptoms, by the way, that I was experiencing, I would get foot cramps, sometimes, Charlie horses, and and fatigue. I would sometimes would be lightheaded. Sometimes I would have unexplained fatigue, and I would just be much more lethargic. Sometimes a combination of all of them, but definitely intense foot cramps. That was one thing that was, sporadic, but tends to be somewhat indicative. And usually, I can tell if I haven't been good about making sure I get enough salt, and then I'll feel that symptom. Next, we've got Mars Tane, carny keto borderline lean mass hyperresponder, cholesterol high but good for this way of life, but CAC 558, high particle number. Doc wants statins immediately, low dose aspirin, 75-year-old active female. Again, appreciate the individual stories. We can't speak to individual cases, but I think, Nick, you probably have an opinion on this generality overall. Would that be true?
I was actually looking through a lot of the comments. There's a lot of questions with personal information. I think it's probably best if we set a precedent of just not responding to the personal ones, because we really can't. And so I don't want to just have it. We read a thing and then say we can't comment on personal cases. If you want to generalize from your case, please just ask the question that you want answered. So
Can I ask a question to you, Nick, that I think you've been very open about? So, of the two of us, I tend to be very, very cautious about describing what I would do given hypothetical circumstances. I'm really more like I just prefer to try to get the data and turn it around. You, on the other hand, being somebody who your LDL is substantially higher, you've had a number of high level doctors kind of pose the question to you that if you did have, say, you yourself, if you had a much higher CAC, if your CT angiogram came back very differently, you've been more open about what you yourself would do. And would you feel comfortable sharing that here on the stream?
Sure. So the way I like to phrase it is with the idea of buffer room. There are a lot of unknowns with respect to this phenotype and risk. So there is an implicit gamble in not having therapy, but there's also a gamble, obviously, in taking therapy. My decision for myself was that I want to evaluate how much buffer room I have based on how things are progressing in me. And as people listening may or may not know, after about 4 years on a ketogenic diet with very high LDL, I decided to get a CCTA, which a CAC wouldn't show anything at my age, but a CCTA might, and my arteries were clear. So I said to myself, okay, I have buffer room to wait for more data to develop. But if I were in a position where I definitely had advanced disease or a very strong family history, I think that would be, a different situation where I would take on pharmacotherapy if I needed to be on a ketogenic diet therapeutically, me personally. So you can read and infer what you will based on your CAC, based on your family history. But, my opinion, and I think this is fair enough to say, statins are neither God's gift to medicine nor rat poison. So, they're medications that have their use like any other, with side effects like any other. And you have to just kind of figure out as an individual how much buffer room do you have to play with. Is this a gamble worth taking? Or, you know, at very minimum, is it worth doing a trial of a therapy to see how it impacts you just to gather data? Just because you start a medication doesn't mean you have to be on it for life. And there are other options as well. There are some, reason to believe that maybe ezetimibe, which is kind of a tamer medication in some ways, might have a similar or even greater impact in lean mass hyperresponders. That's pure speculation right now. But one of the studies that I'd love to do is a crossover because, it could be that we have an abnormally, we being lean mass hyperresponders, large response to ezetimibe, even more so than statins. And I think that would be informative. So bottom line, individual decision, we have a lot of data that we need to collect.
This is a pretty good question. If the lean mass hyperresponder study shows 0 to no plaque progression, what will criticisms of it be, and what expanded studies will be required to change the default hypothesis? Let me first manage expectations. I believe you could go grab a random 0 risk factor group of 55-year-olds, and you're probably going to see plaque progression. I myself expect some level of plaque progression. The interesting question is how that compares to other 0 risk factor groups, ones that have a high LDL versus don't. But as you come into middle age, that tends to be the greater commonality. So while I'll answer this question, I'll just say that I think it's very, it's an outlier possibility. But what would criticisms be? Well, I mean, it'd be the same ones that we acknowledge up front are limitations, right? So this is, of course, a pilot study. There is I love that we have 100. 100's a fantastic number. I'm always going to want a larger number for every study, just because you get more and more power the larger the study gets. Understandably, if there's whether we started with a control group versus when we're doing a match control, I'm excited to say that we are doing match control. And while I can't speak too much to it right now, that I think will be relevant as well. But the problem is we can't do a match control for progression. So if you do see a positive progression, as I think is a very real possibility, how much of that progression will be for another group of 55-year-olds but with low LDL, that's going to be tough to say. And so that would be likely another critique. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the critique's kind of already been laid out. You can see the goalpost shifting. I think the one major one will be, oh, well, it's not enough time, which is kind of a high level and to some degree fair critique. The fact of the matter is, these people will probably be continuously monitored. And while one could make it, a 5-year study, you'd have to pass the 1-year time point to get to that 5-year study anyway. So we're just reporting the data as they come in. You can think about it like that. But I think more to the point is that consulted with experts in the field, and this is a very standard duration of time over which you would at these levels be expected to see plaque progression based on current modeling. And even people that probably are the biggest detractors, like Thomas Dayspring, have literally referred, and you can look at our video with plant chompers recently, to Matt Budoff as the expert in this field. So people defer to the PI of this study for making decisions such as this. So I think, appropriate in that respect. One that I really find funny that's come up again and again is like, oh yeah, but they're so healthy. So there's like a healthy user bias, which is like, yeah, that's the point. Like,
Yes.
oh, they have all the risk factors. I'm like, yeah, so we're isolating the risk factor of interest. So if somebody brings up, well, they're a healthy population, that is exactly the point. That is just reinforcing the statement at hand.
I mean, a good way of putting it is if a patient walks through the door of a doctor's office and they meet all of our eligibility criteria, would it be likely that a doctor with, say, the mean average of LDL of 260 from our population, but otherwise no major cardiovascular risk factors, would say, yeah, I think that you're at a low risk. It's suboptimal. You'd be slightly better off, slightly, with a lower one. But because you're a healthy individual, I think that you're probably, along with other people like you, are at a low risk. That's just not what's happening. We over and over again get people who come to the Facebook groups, to the lean mass hyperresponder Facebook groups, and they say that their doctor is highly concerned. And I can never say it enough times, the doctor could be right. That's why we go and get data. Just go and literally measure the data from these folks to find out if there really is going to be a difference.
Yeah. And the one other thing I'll say, which isn't actually a limitation, but a strength of the study, is while we have a cutoff that is a pretty high threshold for LDL, there's still a massive distribution with LDLs like at 200 and LDLs at like 590. And what this study allows us to do is not just look LMHR versus, match control, but across lean mass hyperresponders with this great diversity in LDL, does the LDL associate with progression? So you
Right.
can imagine kind of like a little graph. It's like, this is your LDL level, this is the amount of progression. And if it's a flat line, there's no association between the LDL level and the progression. Well, that's kind of telling as well. And now there's 100 people, so it might not be powered to find statistical significance. But like, even just looking at the slope. If there's slope up to, oh yeah, there's actually seems to be a relationship, that will be very informative to me. But if it's just a flat line, whereas like the person with an LDL of close to 600 versus the person of an LDL of close to 200, you know, the LDL didn't seem to make a big difference in their plaque progression. Well, that's pretty informative.
Yeah, that gets to internal validity with regard to association, because it for sure we'd see association given that degree of exposure. The expectation is that if you've got the higher exposure of LDL cholesterol and ApoB, the higher the exposure, the greater likelihood of plaque presentation and progression. So another one is interesting. I'm going to generalize it, but it's a question from somebody who's explaining that they failed a 3-hour glucose test.
I read that one, yeah.
Yeah. So of course, by that she's speaking to an oral glucose tolerance test, and it's fairly well known at this point that especially if you're fully fat adapted, you are more likely than not to fail an oral glucose tolerance test. Even Kraft back in the 1970s was already starting to see that there was some relevance as to how much somebody is low carb or not at baseline. And so, as is often the case, many expecting to take on an oral glucose tolerance test, either they're adapting themselves a bit more to a mixed diet that includes more carbohydrates, or they're looking to find what the new context is. And unfortunately, Nick, I don't know that a new context of a keto version of an OGTT has been laid out anywhere in any kind of guideline. Am I right about that?
Yeah, an OGTT is pretty crude measurement. It's not actually looking at insulin sensitivity, and it's assuming mixed diet context. And the guidelines for preparing for an OGTT are not in step with current evidence. David Ludwig had a paper on readapting to carbohydrates when you've been low carb, and it takes weeks. So it's not like you can just prep for a few days before an OGTT. The individual asking the question, I think it's fine to share that she's pregnant. And the OGTT was in the context of screening for gestational diabetes, which you do at like 24 to 28 weeks. She states her HbA1c is 5.3%, so pretty normal. My speculation is it's going to be a false positive. It's not a lot of pregnant people on ketogenic diets, but because you become carbohydrate, your insulin is probably very low. That would be my guess overall. Now, pregnant state, it is difficult to interpret. I don't know what the clinical significance would be if one is not being treated, because if one is controlling with diet alone, then the effect on the child is often from the sequelae of bona fide diabetes and insulin resistance. Like you have high glucose, that transfers through the placenta to the child, they secrete insulin, and then you can get complications at birth, like hypoglycemia, hypercalcemia, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's a false positive and you're not being medicated, I don't know that it's much more than it's probably going to just go on your medical record as you've screened positive or actually tested positive for GDM. But that is a shame of the system, is that I don't think it's properly contextualized. So I don't know about this individual's medical history, but I think there's a possibility it's a false positive in a sense.
As an add-on to that, as a comment that just came in, didn't Ben Bickman say that healthy pregnant women, become insulin resistant? Knowing Ben Bickman, I think he actually would have pushed back at the term insulin resistant.
He would have.
He's very
insulin resistance.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but in pregnancy. So in pregnancy, something happens at 24 to 28 weeks or around that period of time. The placenta makes human placental lactogen to make someone insulin resistant, so that you have increasing glucose levels, so that you have a gradient to send to the fetus. It's a state where you actually want to induce insulin resistance. So there's a hormone made by the placenta, HPL, which causes insulin resistance.
This is why, by the way, I push back with Bickman. As much as he wants to rebrand insulin resistance to only be in the pathogenic state, I like to make the distinction. I still do, in that I think that there should be a distinction between physiological insulin resistance, which, for lack of a better way of putting it, is the insulin resistance you probably wanted, versus pathological insulin resistance, which is that which is illness causing, as would be typical of pathological, right? And
Yeah.
there's an important difference between those two contexts, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's like a three-way Venn diagram. There's like insulin resistance that's pathological. There's just insulin resistance in general, and there's glucose intolerance or maybe concentric circles. They're all slightly different things, but your insulin's going to go up in pregnancy because your body's trying to get big, and you're going to be insulin resistant in part because you're secreting human placental lactogen. And then if if it makes you insulin resistant beyond a threshold, you can develop proper gestational diabetes. And it goes along with things that you would expect. It's actually very logical. So one of the risk factors is multiple gestations. If you have twins, why? You have twins, you have more baby to feed, you have more placenta that you have. So more placenta makes more HPL, you get more insulin resistant. It's all very sensible, physiologically speaking.
So we have time for about 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap. This from Patrice. Can you say how many women are in your study group and how many may be post-menopause? So I can say that we have roughly 40. I can say what I reported in Denver was 40, and it might be off a little bit on their update of data. Again, that was the crude data, but it's going to be roughly around that amount. I cannot say how many are postmenopausal. That information has not been provided to me yet, and I'm understandably blinded from the data thus far. But I do think it's a relevant question and a good one to ask. We should hopefully know at the point of publication. And then if you, okay, if your hypothesis eventually, I'm going to tweak this a little bit, but if your hypothesis eventually proves out correctly that LDL is not in itself a driver of atherosclerosis, do you think, I'll just say, do you think the manufacturers of cholesterol-lowering drugs would be interested in that? I'm going to rephrase it that way. But basically, go ahead, Nick.
I just want to clarify, that is not our hypothesis.
Correct.
I think it's an important thing to say on the record. At no point, and this is often misrepresented, have we hypothesized that LDL is not a driver of atherosclerosis. That's
in fact, even
it's defensible.
In fact, I've stated many times, even before Nick and I were collaborating, I've stated many times over that I do believe that ApoB containing lipoproteins are participants in the process of atherosclerosis. I know it's a technical distinction, but it's an important one because I feel like both sides oversimplify this thing. And I know, Nick, you agree with me in that it's one thing to say, hey, there might be more to this story. And for that matter, the lipid imaging model might explain why there could be higher levels of LDL that don't associate with atherosclerosis, even though we acknowledge that that's a hypothesis. But that in and of itself is not categorically, is not mutually exclusive from how ApoB containing lipoproteins can be part of the process of atherosclerosis. So to use a simple example, monocytes are in our bloodstream right now. They differentiate into macrophages, and macrophages are the other major component of plaque. There are several components of plaques, but the two of interest are LDL and macrophages. And macrophages, likewise, therapies, animal models, where they can reduce the influx of macrophages into the suboptimal space will result in less atherosclerosis. So it'd be accurate to say monocytes are causal for atherosclerosis, or at least part of the causal chain. But reducing them, even though that can reduce atherosclerosis, doesn't mean you solve the problem, because you have other downstream problems with the immune response that can be a problem as well. So what we're interested in, getting back to kind of what we were just talking about before with insulin resistance, is there such a thing as physiologically higher levels of LDL that don't have an association pathology, especially atherosclerosis? And that's what we're working on right now. But I'm confident nobody on our team, including Nick and myself, would suddenly say, and therefore we assume that ApoB containing lipoproteins have nothing to do with atherosclerosis, because we both firmly believe that that is the case.
Well said.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and wrap there. Guys, thank you so much for popping in. We'll probably try to do another Q&A stream again soon. Nick is finally kind of coming out of the cloud, the intensity that is being a second year Harvard med student, and hopefully we can maybe do some more streams like this if you guys like it. Feel free to leave some comments and let us know what you thought. And if you have any additional questions, maybe we can also add them. We can answer some of these on social media. So otherwise, hope you guys all have a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you later.
Last comment. I predict a Nobel Prize for you one day, Dave Feldman.
Okay. Thanks, Nick.